Welcome back to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Helgo. We are in Human Biology, Chapter 1, Part 2, talking about homeostasis. If you have not been filling out your worksheet, please make sure you get that and are filling it out with the diagram. If you remember, we talked about what mechanisms happened when your body temperature increased above the normal range. Now let's see what happens when the body temperature decreases below the normal range. Three things happen here. The hypothalamus detects the change and causes decreased sweating, constriction of skin blood vessels, and shivering. The decreased sweating will reduce heat loss due to when the sweat evaporates. Constriction of skin blood vessels, so that means the blood vessels are getting smaller, so there's less blood flowing through the blood vessels and you're losing less heat from that. And then shivering, we know, is when the small muscles are moving, and that creates heat itself. So that brings the body temperature up back towards normal and keeps it in homeostasis. This is an example of a negative feedback loop, which is a method for maintaining homeostasis where the stimulus results in the opposite response. Let's look at some examples so that it'll make more sense. Body temperature. We just looked at that example. When your body temperature is too low, the stimulus, your body tries to make the temperature higher, resulting in an opposite response. The same thing happens with blood pressure. If it's too high or low, your body brings it back up to normal. Blood glucose, if your levels are too high or too low, your body needs to bring it back up to normal. And any hormone level, your body needs to keep in check. Looking on page 7 in your book are some nice examples of this concept. The opposite is a positive feedback loop, where the stimulus results in increased response. Examples are blood clotting, where when you have thrombocytes or platelets that respond to a blood clot, they tell more of the thrombocytes to go to that site. And in childbirth, so when the hormone is released and tells the uterus to contract, that keeps going more and more and more, which is what you want in childbirth because you need to get the baby out. So let's move on to metabolism. And metabolism is a more general description than perhaps what you're thinking about from food science. It is all life-sustaining reactions within the body make up metabolism. There are two types. Catabolism, where complex substances are broken down. For example, complex carbohydrates are broken into simple sugars. The opposite is anabolism. Building blocks are used to make complex molecules that are needed for growth and repair. For example, using fatty acids to build up a phospholipid to repair your cell membrane. Also, energy from breaking down nutrients is stored in ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is your energy currency of a cell. Perhaps you remember that from biology. Okay, we are going to be talking about body directions. The correct anatomical position, and please write this down, is standing erect, face forward, upper limbs at your sides, and palms forward. So I'll give you an example of that. If you can see that my palms are forward and standing erect. Okay, first one is superior, above another part of the body. The opposite would be inferior, below another part. One word is anterior, which is towards the front. Another word in humans is the same as ventral. Ventral means towards the front and anterior means towards the head, but since our face and our front, since we stand on two legs, anterior and ventral are the same in humans. So posterior is towards the back, and another word is dorsal, also towards the back. Medial means towards the midline, and its opposite, lateral, is towards the side of a body. Proximal means closer to your trunk, and distal means farther from the trunk. So example, my elbow is proximal, it's more proximal than my index finger. My index finger is distal to my elbow. Here are some examples: superior, inferior, anterior or ventral, and posterior or dorsal, and then proximal and distal. Another thing you should be aware of are the planes of division, how you could cut an object. So coronal or frontal plane, you do need to know both words, sorry, is an imaginary plane that divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. We'll go through all of these and then let's look at some pictures on the next slide. Sagittal or median plane is an imaginary plane that is lengthwise along the midline that divides the body into right and left. And then your transverse or horizontal plane is an imaginary line that divides the body into superior and inferior portions. So looking at this, we had our coronal, which divided the body into anterior and posterior sections. We had the sagittal plane, or median plane, which divides the body into right and left hemispheres. And we have the transverse plane, which divides the body into superior and inferior sections. Let's look at some more examples. If you see the brain, the coronal plane cuts it into anterior and posterior sections. The sagittal, if you see it's right down the midline, cuts it into right and left hemispheres. And then a transverse plane will cut it into anterior and posterior sections. Now, if you are cutting a piece of tissue, perhaps you were trying to look at a piece of tissue under the microscope, we have separate names for those cuts. One is a cross section, which the cut is perpendicular to the long axis, and it would look like this. And I would like you to make a drawing of that, so if you need to pause the video, you may do that. Another is a longitudinal cut, and the cut is made parallel to the long axis like this. And the third is an oblique cut, where the cut is made at an angle. So some more terminology you're going to need are the body cavities. Starting with the dorsal cavity. In the dorsal cavity is the cranial cavity, which holds your brain, and the spinal cavity, which holds your spine. And here is a view. So everything that's yellow is the dorsal cavity, the cranial cavity is here, and the spinal cavity is here. Next, we are going to look at the thoracic cavity, which is everything in the salmon color. We're going to be looking at the ventral cavity, which includes the thoracic cavity, and everything in salmon was the ventral cavity. So the thoracic cavity is divided into a pleural cavity, which holds your lungs, and the pericardial cavity, which holds your heart. The diaphragm separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities. The abdominal cavity holds most of your organs, your stomach, intestines, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, and spleen. And your pelvic cavity holds the urinary bladder, rectum, and any internal reproductive organs. So looking again, we have our dorsal cavity and our ventral cavity. So the thoracic cavity, the diaphragm separates that from the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. Looking at it from a coronal view or frontal view, again, your dorsal cavity and your ventral cavity. And here you can see the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. So also we would like to be able to talk about not just in my belly, but specifically where is there a problem in the abdomen. So there are 9 regions. 3 central regions are named from superior to inferior: epigastric, umbilical, and hypogastric. And then on each side there are 3 outside regions, again from superior to inferior: hypochondriac, lumbar, and iliac, or sometimes you'll see inguinal. Now let's look at a picture of this. Before we look at the picture, I do want you to remember it's the patient's right or left. It's the opposite of your body because you're looking at the patient. So this, you may think this is right, but this is the patient's left. So it is the epigastric region, umbilical, and hypogastric region. And then left hypochondriac region, left lumbar region, left iliac region, and over on the right, right hypochondriac region, right lumbar region, and right iliac region. I do need you to make this drawing. You can just do the crisscross, you don't have to draw the body underneath. So pause the video for a moment while you make that drawing. Okay, moving on to page 13, there is some medical terminology. I've abridged it. You do not need to learn all 40 words, but there are still terms that will be very useful later on. First up, cervical, which is for the neck. You may wonder why you learned about it in health class, because we'll talk about that in class. I don't want you to get confused. Then there is the thoracic, which is for the chest region. Deltoid, which is for the shoulder. Scapular, which is the shoulder blade. Brachial, which is the arm. Carpal, which is the wrist. Umbilical, which is the navel. Inguinal, which is the groin. Iliac, which is the hip. Lumbar, which is the lower back. Gluteal, which is the buttocks. Femoral, which is your thigh. Patellar, which is the knee. Tarsal, which is the ankle. And calcaneal, which is the heel. So, in our next video, we are going to talk about labeling all of our medical terminology terms. See you then.